The greatest treasures are never the ones that glitter first. The first thing Ethan Walker noticed was not the gold. It should have been. Any other man who had wandered through the narrow stone passage beneath the forgotten estate would have frozen at the sight before him. Wooden crates split with age rested against walls carved from solid granite, their broken lids spilling stacks of gleaming gold bars that caught the pale light from his lantern. Ancient coins lay scattered across the dusty floor as though someone had abandoned them in a hurry decades earlier. Tarnished silver cups, velvet pouches stitched with fading thread, and jeweled boxes sat untouched beneath layers of dust so thick they softened every edge. It looked less like a treasure room than a place where time itself had quietly gone to sleep. Ethan stood perfectly still, his breathing slow, the warm glow of the lantern dancing across the rough stone ceiling above. His weathered hand tightened around the old brass handle, while his eyes searched every corner with the calm discipline that had followed him long after leaving the Navy SEAL teams. He had entered enough forgotten places during his years of service to know that appearances rarely told the whole story. Even now, standing inside a chamber that could have changed his life forever, instinct whispered louder than excitement. Beside him stood Ranger, an adult German shepherd, classic black and tan coat, strong healthy build, alert intelligent eyes, no accessories. The loyal dog had followed Ethan through abandoned farms, snow-covered forests, forgotten churches, empty mining towns, and lonely mountain cabins where silence carried memories heavier than words. Normally, Ranger explored every unfamiliar room with measured curiosity, carefully circling before settling beside his partner. This time, he never looked at the gold. Not once. His ears remained forward, every muscle still beneath his coat, as though listening to something buried deeper than sound. Ethan watched him carefully. Ranger slowly turned away from the mountains of treasure and padded across the stone floor without hesitation. The dog's paws stirred tiny clouds of dust that floated through the lantern light like drifting ash. At the far end of the chamber stood an old wooden door almost invisible against the rock wall. It was narrow, weathered, and so ordinary that Ethan had nearly dismissed it as part of the ancient structure itself. Iron hinges had surrendered to rust long ago, while faded carvings disappeared beneath decades of neglect. Nothing about the forgotten door suggested value. Nothing except Ranger. The dog stopped directly before it. He lowered his nose toward the crack beneath the frame, inhaled slowly, then sat without moving another inch. Seconds passed inside absolute silence. Then came 3 calm, deliberate barks. Not frantic, not frightened, not excited. 3 measured barks Ethan had learned never to ignore. He felt a familiar chill settle across his shoulders despite the stale warmth trapped underground. Ranger had used that signal only a handful of times before. Each time it had led them somewhere neither maps nor logic could explain. Ethan's gaze drifted back toward the glittering treasure behind him. Gold enough to erase every unpaid bill. Gold enough to buy land, build a home, replace his aging pickup, and finally stop sleeping wherever the road ended. After years of drifting from seasonal construction jobs to repair work in forgotten towns, after countless nights beneath worn blankets inside abandoned cabins or beneath open skies, the sight of such fortune should have overwhelmed every other thought. Instead, it felt strangely unimportant. The room itself seemed to breathe with quiet patience, as though waiting to see which direction he would choose. Dust floated lazily through the lantern glow, while somewhere beyond the stone walls, water dripped with slow, steady rhythm. Ethan stepped away from the treasure. Every footstep echoed softly beneath the vaulted ceiling until he reached Ranger's side. He rested one steady hand against the dog's neck, feeling the calm strength beneath warm fur. Ranger never took his eyes from the forgotten door. Ethan studied the faded wood inches from his face. Someone had carved a small symbol near the center years ago, almost erased by time. It wasn't decorative. It looked intentional, personal, like a promise left behind for someone patient enough to notice. His fingers brushed across the rough grain, lifting decades of dust into the air. The ancient wood felt colder than the surrounding stone. Behind him, an entire fortune remained untouched, glowing quietly inside the lantern light like a test no one had expected him to face. Ahead of him stood one forgotten door that seemed to hold nothing at all. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment. listening not to the silence around him, but to the quiet certainty that had kept both him and Ranger alive through countless impossible roads. When he opened them again, he wrapped his hand around the old iron handle, completely unaware that the greatest inheritance waiting beneath the mountain had never been hidden inside the gold at all. The old iron handle resisted at first, refusing to move as though it had not been touched in generations. Ethan applied only enough pressure to test it, unwilling to force something that had survived longer than most men ever would. A faint groan echoed through the stone chamber as rust surrendered little by little. Dust drifted from the hinges, filling the lantern light with slow swirling ribbons that seemed almost alive. Ranger remained perfectly still beside him, his alert, intelligent eyes fixed on the narrow opening as it widened one careful inch at a time. There was no rush in the silence, no sense of danger, only the strange feeling that whatever waited beyond the forgotten door had been patiently expecting someone to arrive. The air on the other side felt different. It carried none of the dry metallic scent that surrounded the gold behind them. Instead, Ethan caught the faint fragrance of aged cedar, old paper, and the lingering warmth of a fireplace that had gone cold many decades before. He lifted the lantern higher and stepped across the threshold. The room was surprisingly small, no larger than a modest study, yet every object inside rested exactly where someone had intentionally left it. A sturdy wooden desk stood beneath a narrow stone window that no longer admitted daylight. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, filled with journals, weathered books, folded maps, and carefully labeled boxes. A simple rocking chair faced an unlit fireplace, its woven blanket untouched beneath a thin layer of dust. On one wall hung a neatly folded American flag enclosed behind aged glass. Beneath it rested several military photographs, their black and white images softened by time but preserved with unmistakable care. Ethan instinctively lowered the lantern. The room did not feel abandoned. It felt remembered. Ranger slowly crossed the floor without making a sound. His nose moved from one object to another, never lingering on anything except a small oak chest resting beneath the desk. He sat beside it and glanced back toward Ethan, waiting with the quiet confidence that had guided them through countless uncertain roads. Ethan knelt beside the chest and brushed away decades of dust with the sleeve of his worn olive-green military field jacket. Unlike the heavy vaults surrounding the treasure room, this chest required no key. The brass latch lifted easily beneath his thumb. Inside lay no jewels, no coins, and no stacks of cash. Instead, he found carefully folded letters tied together with faded blue ribbon, an old leather notebook worn smooth from years of handling, a silver compass, a pair of reading glasses, and a single polished wooden plaque engraved with one simple sentence. If you found this room before you claimed the gold, then you came looking for something greater than wealth. Ethan read the words twice without speaking. They felt less like instructions and more like recognition, as though the unseen owner already understood the heart of the stranger standing there. He carefully lifted the notebook into the lantern light. The first page bore a name written in steady handwriting: Captain Benjamin Holloway, United States Navy. Below it appeared a date nearly half a century old. Ethan felt an unexpected stillness settle over him. He had never known the man, yet the careful order of the room spoke a language every serviceman recognized without explanation. Discipline remained visible even after its owner was gone. Nothing had been arranged for display. Everything had been preserved with purpose. Ranger gently rested one paw against the edge of the desk, drawing Ethan's attention toward an old framed photograph standing beside the journals. The picture showed a much younger Benjamin Holloway smiling beside another service member outside a weathered coastal training facility. Between them sat a German shepherd whose proud posture looked remarkably familiar. Ethan studied the dog's calm expression for a long moment before quietly smiling to himself. Loyalty, he thought, had always found its way across generations. A soft breeze suddenly drifted through the room, although no windows stood open. The pages of the leather notebook turned by themselves until they stopped halfway through. Ethan looked down and found a pressed wildflower resting between the pages beside a handwritten sentence that seemed almost impossibly personal. The right door always appears after the wrong treasure. Ethan slowly closed the notebook, his thoughts returning to the untouched gold waiting beyond the stone wall. For the first time since entering the underground chamber, he realized the treasure had never been hidden beneath the mountain at all. It had been hidden behind a choice. Anyone driven only by fortune would have filled their pockets and walked away. Only someone willing to leave the gold behind would ever discover the quiet room where another man's life, memories, and unfinished purpose still waited with remarkable patience. Ethan carried the leather notebook to the desk as though it deserved more respect than his own tired hands could offer. He placed the lantern beside it, allowing the warm amber light to spread gently across the worn pages. Ranger settled quietly on the old wooden floor, his alert, intelligent eyes following every movement while the silence around them grew softer instead of heavier. Somewhere beyond the stone walls, water continued its slow journey through the mountain, each distant drop sounding less like isolation and more like the steady heartbeat of a place that had never truly been abandoned. Ethan opened the journal again, this time with the patience of a man reading another soldier's final conversation rather than searching for hidden clues. The handwriting remained steady from page to page, careful and deliberate, shaped by someone who believed words carried weight long after voices disappeared. Captain Benjamin Holloway did not write about riches. He wrote about seasons. He described autumn mornings when fog drifted across the valley before sunrise, the smell of cedar after heavy rain, and the comforting sound of old floorboards settling during long winter nights. He wrote about repairing fences that no one else remembered, planting apple trees whose fruit he knew he might never taste, and watching deer gather peacefully at the edge of the forest each evening as though the land itself trusted quiet hearts. Ethan slowly turned another page. The journal spoke often about service, but never about medals or recognition. Instead, Benjamin described the privilege of protecting strangers, the burden of carrying memories that could never be fully explained, and the importance of choosing kindness even when no one would ever know the choice had been made. One sentence had been carefully underlined in faded ink. A man does not become wealthy by counting what he owns. He becomes wealthy by protecting what cannot be replaced. Ethan remained still for several moments, reading the line again while memories surfaced from places inside himself he rarely visited. He remembered small acts of generosity from people whose names he had forgotten long ago. A waitress who quietly paid for his breakfast during his first difficult winter after leaving the military. A mechanic who repaired his truck without charging him because he noticed the service sticker on the windshield. A retired teacher who offered Ranger fresh water every afternoon outside her little country store without ever asking for anything in return. None of those moments had changed the world. Yet together they had quietly carried him through years when hope often felt farther away than tomorrow. Ranger suddenly lifted his head toward the shelves lining the far wall. His ears shifted slightly before he stood and walked with calm confidence toward a narrow bookcase tucked into the corner of the room. Ethan followed. Several journals rested neatly beside small wooden boxes labeled with years stretching back decades. Each box contained simple keepsakes rather than valuables. Pressed leaves gathered from different seasons. Hand-carved birds. Children's thank you notes written in uneven handwriting. Old photographs of families smiling outside restored homes. Receipts showing anonymous donations made to churches, food pantries, and local schools. Benjamin had quietly spent much of his life giving away what many people would have proudly displayed. At the very bottom of the shelf, Ethan discovered a folded map. It showed the surrounding valley with dozens of small circles drawn in blue pencil. Beside each location, Benjamin had written brief notes. Widow Johnson finally has a new roof. School library repaired before winter. Orchard replanted after the storm. Community well restored. Ethan slowly realized the hidden fortune beneath the mountain had never been collected for personal comfort. It had quietly sustained an entire region for years without anyone knowing where the help came from. The gold had simply been a tool. The real inheritance had always been compassion practiced without applause. Ranger stopped beside one final object resting alone on the shelf. It was an old cedar box polished smooth by countless hands. Ethan carefully opened the lid. Inside rested dozens of handwritten letters addressed to people across nearby towns. None had ever been mailed. The first envelope carried only 3 words on its front. To whoever comes. Ethan gently unfolded the letter. The paper had yellowed with time, but every sentence remained perfectly clear. If you are reading this, then my faithful hope was not misplaced. I prayed that one day another servant would choose curiosity over greed, truth over comfort, and people over possessions. Gold can build walls, but character builds homes. If your companion led you here, trust him. Some hearts hear what others never will. Ethan looked toward Ranger, who quietly wagged his tail once before sitting beside the desk again. The gesture was simple, almost ordinary, yet it carried a quiet certainty that settled deep within Ethan's soul. For the first time in many years, standing inside a forgotten room hidden beneath an abandoned estate, he no longer felt like a man wandering without direction. He felt like someone who had finally arrived exactly where he had been meant to be. Morning arrived so quietly that Ethan did not notice the passing of the hours until a pale ribbon of sunlight slipped through the narrow crack above the hidden chamber and rested across the old desk. The mountain seemed to awaken one careful breath at a time. Water continued its gentle rhythm somewhere beyond the stone walls, while the faint scent of cedar lingered in the cool air as though the room itself remembered every season that had ever passed through it. Ethan closed the final letter with both hands and sat in thoughtful silence. Ranger, an adult German shepherd, classic black and tan coat, strong healthy build, alert intelligent eyes, no accessories, remained beside the cedar box, watching his partner with the patient confidence that needed no words. Ethan had entered the forgotten estate searching for temporary shelter from another uncertain week on the road. Instead, he had stepped into another man's lifetime of quiet purpose. The realization settled slowly inside him, not with excitement, but with an unfamiliar sense of peace. He rose from the chair and carefully returned every journal, every letter, and every keepsake exactly where he had found it. Nothing in this room belonged in careless hands. Every object carried the weight of memory rather than price. As he reached toward the final shelf, something unusual caught his attention. Behind several weathered books rested a narrow wooden frame almost hidden against the stone wall. It held a faded photograph unlike the others. Benjamin Holloway stood outside a modest white farmhouse beside an elderly couple whose smiles carried the unmistakable warmth of people who had known difficult years and still chosen gratitude. Several children stood barefoot in the grass, laughing beside a freshly painted porch. On the back of the photograph, someone had written in careful handwriting, "Home is never built with lumber alone." Ethan quietly smiled. The words reminded him of something his own father had once said while repairing their old front porch before Ethan had ever dreamed of wearing a military uniform. A house keeps out the weather. A home keeps hope alive. The memory arrived unexpectedly, yet left behind comfort instead of sorrow. Ranger suddenly walked toward the fireplace and lowered his nose near the old stone hearth. He did not bark this time. Instead, he gently touched one loose stone with his paw before looking back toward Ethan. Curious, Ethan knelt beside him. The stone shifted more easily than expected, revealing a small compartment no larger than a shoebox. Inside rested only one object. It was an old brass key attached to a smooth piece of oak engraved with a simple address several miles away in a nearby valley. No explanation accompanied it. No map. No instructions. Only the key and another folded note written in Benjamin's familiar hand. Ethan carefully unfolded the paper. Some doors open with metal. Others open because someone finally arrives carrying the right heart. If this key has reached you, then the next chapter no longer belongs to me. It belongs to those still waiting above the mountain. Ethan studied the address for a long moment. He had driven through the surrounding countryside before reaching the abandoned estate and could not remember seeing anything remarkable in that direction. Perhaps the place no longer existed. Perhaps it had changed beyond recognition. Yet Benjamin had preserved the key with extraordinary care, suggesting its purpose remained unfinished. Ethan slipped the key into the inside pocket of his worn olive-green military field jacket, feeling its reassuring weight settle close to his heart. It was the only item he allowed himself to take because the note had clearly been written for whoever reached this room through honesty rather than greed. Before leaving, he looked once more toward the hidden treasure beyond the doorway. The gold remained exactly as it had been when he first arrived, untouched beneath its blanket of dust, silent and strangely distant now. Only a day earlier, he might have measured his future by its value. Now it seemed less important than a handwritten letter, an old photograph, or a weathered key pointing toward people he had never met. Ranger quietly walked toward the exit without hesitation. Ethan followed, carrying the lantern in one hand while the morning light gradually grew brighter along the stone passage ahead. As they climbed the worn staircase toward the world above, he noticed something he had overlooked before. Along the rough wall, someone had carved a final message where every visitor would see it while leaving rather than entering. The letters were shallow from age, but still clear enough to read. The treasure was never hidden beneath this mountain. It has always walked back into the sunlight, one kind soul at a time. Ethan paused only long enough to rest his hand against the carved stone. Then he continued upward beside Ranger, unaware that the quiet address resting inside his pocket would soon lead them toward lives waiting to be changed in ways neither of them could yet imagine. The mountain air felt different once Ethan stepped outside, as though the world above had quietly continued while something inside him had changed forever. Morning sunlight spilled across the weathered stones of the abandoned estate, warming patches of moss that clung stubbornly to broken walls. Pine trees swayed gently beneath a clear blue sky, their branches whispering together whenever the breeze wandered through the valley. Ranger, an adult German shepherd, classic black and tan coat, strong healthy build, alert intelligent eyes, no accessories, paused near the old entrance and looked back only once before turning toward the narrow trail leading downhill. Ethan understood the silent invitation. Some journeys ended with answers. Others only began after the first answer had been found. He adjusted the worn olive-green military field jacket across his shoulders and slipped the brass key deeper into his pocket before following his faithful companion through the forest. The trail curved along a quiet stream where smooth stones rested beneath crystal-clear water. Sunlight shimmered across the surface, creating ribbons of silver that drifted lazily with the current. Ethan stopped for a moment to refill his canteen while Ranger drank nearby. The simple routine reminded him how little a person truly needed when peace finally replaced urgency. For years he had measured every day by the next temporary job, the next tank of gasoline, the next place safe enough to sleep. Today, for the first time in longer than he could remember, he was not chasing survival. He was following purpose. The address engraved on the wooden tag pointed toward a farming community several miles south of the mountain. According to an old highway sign they passed shortly after noon, the valley had once been known for apple orchards and family dairies, although many properties now stood empty as younger generations moved toward larger cities. Ethan drove his aging pickup slowly along quiet county roads bordered by weathered fences and fields glowing beneath late summer sunlight. Ranger remained unusually attentive, sitting upright in the passenger seat with his alert, intelligent eyes scanning every passing farmhouse as though searching for something familiar. Eventually, they reached a narrow gravel lane lined with towering maple trees. At the end of the lane stood a modest white farmhouse with a broad front porch and a red barn resting behind it. Time had weathered the buildings, but someone still cared enough to sweep the porch, trim the grass, and hang flower baskets beneath every window. Ethan parked beneath the shade of an old oak tree and remained seated for a moment. The brass key felt unexpectedly heavy inside his pocket. It belonged here. He could feel it with the same quiet certainty that had guided him toward the hidden room beneath the mountain. Before he reached the porch, the front door opened gently. An elderly woman stepped outside carrying a small watering can. Her silver hair was neatly gathered behind her head, and her soft blue sweater fluttered lightly in the afternoon breeze. She looked neither surprised nor alarmed to find a stranger standing at the end of her walkway. Instead, her eyes settled on Ranger first. A warm smile slowly appeared across her face. "I wondered how long it would take," she said softly, almost as though continuing a conversation that had paused years earlier. Ethan stopped in quiet surprise. "You were expecting someone?" he asked. The woman nodded with calm confidence. "Not someone specific. Only the person who chose the smaller door before the larger fortune." Ethan felt his heartbeat slow. Benjamin Holloway had prepared far more carefully than he had ever imagined. The woman introduced herself as Eleanor Brooks. She invited Ethan onto the porch where two wooden rocking chairs overlooked the orchard stretching beyond the fields. Fresh lemonade rested on a small table between them as though it had been prepared that very morning. Ranger lay comfortably at Ethan's feet, completely relaxed. his tail gently brushing the old porch boards. Eleanor looked toward the faithful dog with quiet admiration. Benjamin always believed the right companion would recognize what human eyes often missed, she said. He told me that one day a veteran would arrive with a dog who trusted truth more than treasure. Ethan carefully removed the brass key from his pocket and placed it on the table. Eleanor did not reach for it immediately. Instead, she looked beyond the orchard where rows of apple trees swayed peacefully beneath the afternoon sun. That key has never opened a lock, she said after a thoughtful silence. It opens a responsibility. Ethan listened without interrupting. Every lesson he had discovered since entering the mountain had arrived the same way, quietly, patiently, allowing understanding to grow naturally rather than demanding immediate answers. Eleanor finally wrapped her fingers around the worn brass key and smiled with unmistakable gratitude. Benjamin knew his time was growing short, she whispered. He spent years preparing for the day someone worthy would continue what he could no longer finish. The mountain protected the treasure, but this valley has always protected the people. Now, if you are willing, there is one more story waiting for you to hear, and it begins not with gold, but with a promise that has remained unbroken for more than 40 years. Eleanor rose from the rocking chair with unhurried grace and motioned for Ethan to follow her across the porch. Ranger, an adult German shepherd, classic black and tan coat, strong healthy build, alert intelligent eyes, no accessories, stood immediately, falling into step beside Ethan as naturally as breathing. The afternoon sun stretched long beams of golden light across the orchard, turning every apple leaf into a small mirror that shimmered softly whenever the breeze passed through. Beyond the final row of trees stood an old red barn whose weathered boards carried the gentle dignity of something lovingly cared for rather than forgotten. Eleanor walked toward it without speaking, allowing the peaceful sounds of the valley to fill the silence. Songbirds drifted from branch to branch above them, while somewhere beyond the fields a windmill turned with slow, patient rhythm. Ethan noticed that every fence post had recently been repaired despite the age of the property. Fresh flowers grew beside the pathways, and the vegetable garden overflowed with healthy plants. Nothing here suggested wealth, yet everything reflected quiet devotion. Eleanor stopped before the wide barn doors and rested one hand against the faded wood. Benjamin always believed that a promise should outlive the person who made it, she said softly. When he returned home after his years of service, he found this valley struggling. Farms were closing. Families were leaving. Children thought they had to abandon the place they loved just to build a future. He decided that if fortune had found him, then fortune belonged to everyone willing to keep hope alive. She pushed the heavy door open, and warm afternoon light spilled across the spacious interior. Instead of old machinery or stacks of hay, Ethan found neatly organized shelves filled with seeds, gardening tools, carpentry equipment, school supplies, blankets, canned food, and carefully labeled boxes prepared for every season. Handwritten tags hung from each shelf with names of nearby families and simple notes reminding volunteers where each item should be delivered. Along one wall stood dozens of wooden crates already packed for the coming winter. Ranger walked quietly through the barn, his alert, intelligent eyes observing every corner before settling near a large bulletin board covered with photographs. Ethan stepped closer. Every picture showed smiling neighbors standing beside repaired homes, restored barns, community gardens, newly planted orchards, or small businesses reopening their doors. Benjamin appeared in only a handful of the photographs, always standing near the back, never at the center, smiling with the quiet satisfaction of someone who preferred to celebrate others rather than himself. Eleanor joined Ethan beside the display. Very few people knew where the money came from, she explained. Benjamin insisted that kindness should never become a performance. If someone needed help paying medical bills, rebuilding after a storm, repairing a roof, or buying books for school, assistance simply arrived. Some believed anonymous donors existed. Others thought miracles happened more often in this valley than anywhere else. She smiled gently. Perhaps they were both correct. Ethan slowly looked around the barn again. The hidden treasure beneath the mountain suddenly made perfect sense. It had never been collected to create luxury. It had quietly become lumber, seed, medicine, education, warm coats, repaired tractors, and second chances for people who never knew the hand that had helped them. Eleanor walked toward a sturdy oak cabinet standing beneath the far window and removed a thick leather ledger. She placed it into Ethan's hands with remarkable trust. The pages contained careful records spanning more than 40 years. Every expense had been documented with extraordinary precision. Every gold bar sold had become dozens of ordinary blessings scattered throughout the valley. Near the final page, Benjamin had written one last entry. "If you are reading this, then my work has ended exactly as I hoped. Never measure this place by what remains in the mountain. Measure it by the laughter still heard in these fields." Ethan closed the ledger slowly, feeling the weight of responsibility settle more deeply than the brass key ever had. Ranger quietly approached and rested against his leg, offering the silent reassurance that had steadied Ethan through countless uncertain moments. Eleanor looked toward the orchard where children could now be heard laughing somewhere beyond the rows of trees. "They come here every Saturday," she said with gentle pride. "They help harvest fruit, learn to grow vegetables, repair fences, and carry food to neighbors who can no longer work their land. Most of them have no idea why this place has survived while so many others disappeared. They only know that someone believed their community was worth saving." Ethan watched the sunlight dance across the orchard and understood that the hidden chamber beneath the mountain had protected far more than gold. It had protected the quiet possibility that goodness, when patiently shared from one life to another, could endure far longer than any fortune ever buried beneath stone. The laughter Eleanor had spoken of arrived before Ethan ever saw the children. It floated across the orchard with the lightness of birdsong, carried gently by the afternoon breeze until it reached the old barn where he still stood holding Benjamin Holloway's ledger. Ranger, an adult German shepherd, classic black and tan coat, strong healthy build, alert intelligent eyes, no accessories, lifted his head toward the sound and gave a slow, relaxed wag of his tail. There was no urgency in his posture now, only quiet curiosity. Ethan followed Eleanor back outside, where sunlight washed over the rows of apple trees in soft golden waves. A group of children and teenagers moved between the branches carrying empty baskets, laughing as they searched for ripe fruit, while several older volunteers offered patient guidance. Nearby, a young father repaired a split fence post beside an elderly neighbor, and two women sorted fresh vegetables beneath a wooden shelter. No one appeared rushed. Every movement seemed connected by an invisible understanding that helping another person was simply part of ordinary life. Eleanor smiled as she watched the scene unfold. Benjamin believed communities become strongest when people stop asking who deserves help and simply begin helping, she said. Over time, generosity teaches others to become generous. Ethan noticed something remarkable. No signs advertised a charity. No banners displayed the names of wealthy donors. No plaques honored the people who had quietly sustained the valley for decades. The orchard carried only the peaceful rhythm of neighbors working together because someone had once shown them how. A little girl with freckles hurried toward Eleanor carrying an overflowing basket nearly too heavy for her small arms. Before Eleanor could reach for it, Ranger calmly stepped beside the child, matching her slow pace all the way to the sorting table. The girl smiled brightly and gently rubbed the top of his head. "Thank you for walking with me," she whispered. Ranger remained perfectly still until the basket rested safely on the table, then returned to Ethan without expecting praise. Eleanor chuckled softly. Benjamin used to say dogs understand service better than most people because they never stop to ask what they receive in return. Ethan looked at Ranger with quiet appreciation. He had trusted the faithful dog through mountain trails, abandoned buildings, frozen roads, and countless uncertain nights. Yet standing in the orchard, Ethan realized Ranger had led him toward something greater than safety. He had led him toward belonging. As the afternoon continued, Ethan joined several volunteers repairing wooden planter boxes near the edge of the garden. The work felt familiar beneath his hands. Measuring boards, tightening bolts, replacing worn supports, and making certain each corner remained square reminded him of years spent solving practical problems with simple tools. Nearby, children planted vegetable seedlings while older neighbors patiently explained which crops would thrive through the coming seasons. The conversations carried no complaints about the past and no worries about tomorrow. They centered instead on weather, harvests, birthdays, family recipes, and hopes for another good year. Ethan found himself smiling more often than he had in years. Before sunset, Eleanor invited everyone to gather beneath a large maple tree overlooking the orchard. Long wooden tables had been arranged beneath its broad branches, covered with homemade bread, fresh apples, garden vegetables, soup, and warm pies cooling on woven cloths. Families bowed their heads together in quiet gratitude before sharing the meal. Ethan noticed an empty chair placed at the end of the table with a small bouquet of wildflowers resting upon it. No one sat there. No explanation seemed necessary. Benjamin's presence lingered not through photographs or speeches, but through the lives still flourishing because of choices he had made long ago. As evening settled across the valley, the sky filled with gentle shades of amber and lavender. Fireflies began appearing above the grass while crickets welcomed the coming night with their steady chorus. Ethan remained beneath the maple tree long after most families had returned home. Ranger rested quietly beside him, watching the orchard as if memorizing every peaceful detail. Eleanor approached carrying 2 steaming mugs of tea and offered one to Ethan before sitting nearby. "Tomorrow," she said softly, "there is someone else you need to meet." Benjamin asked that the final part of his story be shared only after you had seen what the treasure truly became. Ethan looked across the orchard where lanterns now glowed warmly along the pathways. For the first time in many years, he no longer wondered where the road would take him next. Instead, he found himself wondering how one quiet life could leave behind so much light for others to follow. The next morning arrived wrapped in a thin layer of silver mist that drifted quietly through the orchard before the first rays of sunlight reached the valley. Dew rested on every blade of grass, turning the fields into a sea of tiny crystals that shimmered whenever the breeze stirred the leaves overhead. Ethan stepped onto the farmhouse porch carrying 2 mugs of fresh coffee, breathing deeply as the cool mountain air filled his lungs. Ranger, an adult German shepherd, classic black and tan coat, strong healthy build, alert intelligent eyes, no accessories, stood at the edge of the porch watching the distant tree line with calm attention. The faithful dog looked peaceful, yet there remained the quiet awareness that had guided them from the forgotten chamber beneath the mountain to this remarkable place. Eleanor joined them a few moments later carrying a weathered canvas satchel that appeared almost as old as the farmhouse itself. Without saying a word, she handed it to Ethan. Inside rested only a single leather folder secured by a faded strap. The cover bore Benjamin Holloway's familiar handwriting. For the one who chose the smaller door. Ethan slowly opened the folder and found several carefully preserved documents, a handful of photographs, and one sealed envelope marked with today's date written decades earlier. His pulse quickened with quiet amazement. Benjamin had somehow anticipated not only that someone would eventually find the hidden room, but that the journey would continue exactly this far. Eleanor nodded gently toward the envelope. "He asked me never to open it," she said softly. "He believed it belonged to the person who reached this porch by following conscience instead of opportunity." Ethan carefully broke the aging wax seal. The paper unfolded with surprising strength despite its years. Benjamin's handwriting appeared as steady as ever. "If these words have reached your hands, then the valley has already welcomed you. That means you have seen children laughing where despair once lived, neighbors helping neighbors without asking for recognition, and fields still producing hope because kindness was planted here season after season. But there is one truth I have not yet shared. The treasure beneath the mountain was never mine." Ethan paused and looked toward Eleanor. She smiled quietly, encouraging him to continue. Benjamin explained that many years earlier he had been asked to safeguard the hidden reserve by a group of aging veterans who had inherited it from families determined to rebuild struggling rural communities after difficult times. None of them wished to become wealthy. Instead, each accepted the responsibility of quietly transforming forgotten places into thriving ones without drawing attention to themselves. As the years passed, Benjamin became the final guardian. Rather than searching for another wealthy investor or influential leader, he searched for someone who still understood service. Someone who would instinctively stop at the unnoticed door instead of the obvious reward. Ethan lowered the letter, feeling the weight of every sentence settle deep within him. It was never about finding a successor with impressive credentials. It was about finding a heart that still believed other people mattered more than possessions. Eleanor gently reached into the satchel once more and removed an old photograph Ethan had not yet seen. It showed a much younger Benjamin standing beside several veterans of different ages outside the very mountain estate Ethan had explored. Beside each man rested a loyal dog. Some were German shepherds. Others were Labrador retrievers and border collies. Every photograph carried the same quiet expression of purpose rather than pride. Benjamin often said the dogs always recognized the right path first, Eleanor whispered. Perhaps because they never become distracted by wealth. Ethan looked toward Ranger, who had wandered to the edge of the porch where a young boy was carefully trying to lift a heavy basket of freshly picked apples. Without hesitation, Ranger walked beside the child, matching his pace exactly until the basket reached the kitchen safely. The boy laughed with gratitude before running back toward the orchard. Ethan smiled warmly. Service, he realized, was rarely complicated. It simply required paying attention to who needed help in the present moment. Benjamin's letter continued with one final request. Do not protect the treasure by hiding it forever. Protect it by making certain its purpose never changes. If future generations remember only the gold, then everything has been lost. If they remember the people whose lives were quietly restored, then the treasure will never disappear, no matter how many bars remain beneath the mountain. Ethan carefully folded the letter and returned it to the leather folder. The morning sun had now fully risen above the orchard, bathing the valley in warm golden light. Families were already gathering among the trees, children laughing as they prepared for another day of work and fellowship. Looking across the peaceful fields, Ethan understood that he had not simply inherited a secret. He had inherited a living promise, one that could only survive if each new day was met with the same quiet courage that had guided Benjamin Holloway for so many faithful years. Over the following days, the valley settled into Ethan's heart with the quiet certainty of sunrise returning after every long night. He found himself waking before dawn without an alarm, stepping onto the farmhouse porch while the world still rested beneath a blanket of pale blue mist. Ranger, an adult German shepherd, classic black and tan coat, strong healthy build, alert intelligent eyes, no accessories, always rose beside him, stretching calmly before following Ethan toward the orchard as though they had belonged there for years instead of days. Every morning carried familiar rituals that somehow felt new. Volunteers gathered to harvest fruit before the afternoon warmth arrived. Children watered vegetable gardens while older neighbors sharpened tools, repaired fences, or prepared baskets for families who could no longer tend their own land. No one gave orders. No one demanded recognition. Everyone simply noticed what needed to be done and quietly began doing it. Ethan admired how naturally kindness moved from one person to another, like sunlight passing through leaves without asking permission. One afternoon, while replacing loose boards on a small footbridge crossing the creek, Ethan noticed an elderly man slowly approaching with the help of a weathered walking stick. His denim jacket had faded from decades beneath open skies, and his gentle gray eyes carried the calm patience of someone who had watched many seasons come and go. Ranger walked toward him first, wagging his tail once before sitting politely at the man's feet. The old gentleman smiled warmly. Benjamin always said the dogs knew before we did, he whispered, gently scratching behind Ranger's ears. Looks like he was right again. The man's name was Samuel Carter. He explained that he had been one of the first young farmers Benjamin quietly helped many years earlier after a harsh winter destroyed nearly every crop his family had planted. I never knew where the money came from, Samuel said as he rested against the bridge railing. One morning I found new seed, repaired equipment, and a note that simply read, "Plant hope again." Nothing more. His eyes drifted across the fields where children now chased one another between rows of apple trees. That single act saved my family's farm. Years later, when I finally learned the truth, Benjamin asked for only one thing in return. He said that if I ever had enough to help someone else, I should do it quietly and never tell them who paid the cost. Ethan listened carefully, recognizing the same pattern repeated through every story he had heard since arriving. Benjamin had never built dependence. He had quietly restored dignity. Samuel reached into his jacket pocket and removed a small folded photograph. It showed a younger Benjamin standing beside a weathered pickup truck loaded with lumber while several volunteers smiled around him. In the corner stood a German shepherd almost identical in posture to Ranger. His name was Marshall, Samuel said softly. Benjamin used to tell us that Marshall refused to walk toward the gold room whenever they visited the mountain. He always stopped outside the hidden door first. Ethan studied the photograph for several quiet moments before carefully handing it back. The similarities felt too meaningful to dismiss as coincidence. Loyalty, wisdom, and quiet service seemed to echo across generations, carried not only by people but by faithful companions who somehow sensed the deeper path before anyone else could see it. That evening, Eleanor invited Ethan into the farmhouse study where an old wooden radio rested upon a bookshelf beside neatly arranged family albums. She turned a small brass knob until gentle music filled the room with warm melodies from another era. Then she opened a drawer and placed a folded legal document before Ethan. "Benjamin completed this years ago," she said quietly. "He asked that I never show it until the right person had heard enough stories to understand why it existed." Ethan unfolded the papers with careful hands. They established a charitable community trust dedicated to preserving the valley, maintaining the hidden reserve responsibly, supporting local families, restoring historic properties, and ensuring that future guardians would always place people before profit. Near the bottom of the final page, Benjamin had written one sentence beneath his signature: "Wealth survives in vaults. Hope survives in human hearts." Ethan looked through the study window where lanterns were beginning to glow across the orchard as neighbors gathered for another peaceful evening together. He understood then that Benjamin had never been searching for someone to inherit gold. He had been searching for someone willing to inherit responsibility without ever claiming ownership. As twilight settled gently across the valley, Ethan quietly accepted that the greatest decision still lay ahead, and it would require him to choose not between poverty and wealth, but between keeping a remarkable secret for himself or allowing its quiet light to continue reaching people who had not yet realized hope was already on its way. That night, sleep refused to come easily. Ethan sat alone on the farmhouse porch while the valley rested beneath a sky crowded with stars, each one shining with the quiet confidence that only darkness could reveal. A cool breeze carried the scent of cedar, freshly turned soil, and ripe apples drifting from the orchard beyond the fence. Ranger, an adult German shepherd, classic black and tan coat, strong healthy build, alert intelligent eyes, no accessories, rested beside the old porch swing with his head raised, watching the distant hills as though standing a silent watch over the sleeping community. The peaceful sounds of crickets and rustling leaves replaced the noise Ethan had grown accustomed to during years spent drifting from one temporary place to another. For the first time in a very long while, silence no longer reminded him of loneliness. It reminded him of trust. He reached into the pocket of his worn olive-green military field jacket and unfolded Benjamin Holloway's final letter once again. The paper had already begun to soften where his fingers repeatedly traced the carefully written words. Benjamin had not instructed him to become the next guardian. He had offered him a choice. That difference mattered. Service could never be inherited through obligation. It had to be accepted freely. Ethan looked toward the orchard where dozens of lanterns still glowed softly along the pathways, even though everyone had gone home hours earlier. They had not been left burning for decoration. They remained lit so that anyone arriving late, lost, or afraid would always find a welcoming light waiting. The realization settled deeply within him. Everything in the valley had been built around people who might someday need hope. The hidden treasure had never existed to create comfort for one person. It existed to protect dignity for many. Before dawn, Ethan quietly walked toward the old barn, carrying the leather ledger beneath one arm. Ranger followed without a sound, his steady footsteps keeping perfect rhythm beside him. Inside the barn, the familiar scent of pine lumber, clean hay, and machine oil filled the cool morning air. Ethan placed the ledger upon the large workbench and slowly turned through every carefully written page once more. 40 years of anonymous generosity stretched before him in precise handwriting. Roofs repaired before winter storms. Medical treatments paid without revealing the donor. Scholarships awarded through quiet gifts. Family farms restored after floods. Food delivered without names attached. Every entry represented a life gently lifted rather than rescued with fanfare. Ethan closed the book and rested both hands upon its worn leather cover. At that moment, he understood exactly what decision he needed to make. A few hours later, Eleanor found him repairing several broken shelves near the back of the barn. She watched quietly until he finished tightening the final bolt before speaking. "You have made your choice," she said with calm certainty. Ethan smiled gently. "I have." She waited patiently without asking what that choice might be. Ethan appreciated that about her. She trusted people enough to let truth arrive in its own time. He carefully handed her the brass key and the leather folder containing Benjamin's letters. "These do not belong to me," he said softly. "Neither does the gold. They belong to the purpose Benjamin protected. If I ever become part of that purpose, it will not be because I own any of it. It will be because I am willing to serve it." Eleanor's eyes filled with quiet gratitude. She accepted the folder but gently closed Ethan's hand around the brass key once again. "The key was never about ownership," she replied. "It was always about stewardship." Benjamin knew the difference. "Now you do too." Later that afternoon, several trustees from neighboring communities quietly arrived at the farmhouse. They were ordinary people: a retired school principal, a local carpenter, a physician from the next county, a librarian, a dairy farmer. None looked wealthy or influential, yet every face reflected the same quiet humility Ethan had seen throughout the valley. They gathered around the old kitchen table while Eleanor shared Benjamin's final documents. No one argued over money. No one asked how much gold remained beneath the mountain. Instead, they discussed families preparing for winter, repairs needed at the community center, scholarships for graduating students, and expanding the orchard program so more children could learn practical skills. Ethan listened in thoughtful silence. He realized he had entered a room filled with people who measured success not by what they possessed, but by how many lives quietly flourished because they chose to care. Ranger lay peacefully beneath the table, occasionally lifting his head whenever someone laughed softly at an old memory of Benjamin. As the afternoon sunlight streamed through the farmhouse windows, Ethan felt something inside him become wonderfully simple. He no longer needed to search for the next destination on the map. He had finally discovered a direction that did not depend upon roads at all. It depended upon choosing, each new day, to become the kind of man who would always stop for the forgotten door before reaching for the shining gold. The following week unfolded with the quiet rhythm of ordinary days. Yet Ethan sensed that every simple task carried deeper meaning than it once had. He repaired loose porch railings, replaced worn fence posts, sharpened gardening tools, and helped children build wooden nesting boxes for bluebirds returning in the spring. Each evening he walked through the orchard beside Ranger, an adult German shepherd, classic black and tan coat, strong healthy build, alert intelligent eyes, no accessories, while the last light of the day painted the hills in soft shades of amber and gold. The valley no longer felt like a place he had discovered. It felt like a place that had patiently been waiting for him. One crisp morning, Eleanor invited Ethan to accompany her into the nearby town. The drive took only 20 minutes along winding country roads lined with maple trees beginning to show the first hints of autumn color. As they entered the small town square, Ethan immediately noticed something unusual. Nearly every storefront looked well cared for despite its age. A family bakery filled the air with the scent of fresh bread. A bookstore displayed handmade signs outside its front door. A small hardware store welcomed customers with flower boxes beneath every window. None of the buildings appeared extravagant, yet together they reflected quiet prosperity built through years of patient effort rather than sudden fortune. Eleanor parked beside a modest brick community center where several residents were preparing for a weekend harvest festival. The mayor, a kind-faced woman named Margaret Ellis, greeted Eleanor with a warm embrace before turning toward Ethan. "We have been hoping to meet you," she said with a gentle smile. Ethan looked surprised. "You knew I was here?" Margaret nodded. "Benjamin prepared us for this day many years ago. He never told us your name because he did not know it himself. He simply said that when the next guardian arrived, we would recognize him by the way he listened before he spoke." Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment, humbled by words he felt he had not yet earned. Margaret invited them inside the community center where old photographs decorated the hallway. Children graduating from school, families celebrating restored homes, volunteers planting trees, veterans receiving handmade quilts, and neighbors gathered around picnic tables filled every wall. At the center of the display hung one simple photograph of Benjamin standing quietly in the background while others laughed together in the foreground. There was no plaque identifying him as the reason so many of those moments had become possible. Margaret noticed Ethan studying the picture. He always insisted that gratitude should point toward hope instead of toward himself, she said softly. He believed people should remember the blessing more than the person who delivered it. They continued into a meeting room where several community leaders had gathered around a long oak table. Teachers, farmers, nurses, business owners, pastors, and volunteers greeted Ethan not with ceremony, but with genuine warmth. After everyone settled into their seats, Margaret placed a weathered wooden box in the center of the table. She carefully opened the lid and removed dozens of handwritten letters tied together with blue ribbon. Benjamin asked every family whose life had been touched by the Valley Trust to write one letter, she explained. Not for him, for whoever continued the work after him. Ethan carefully unfolded the first letter. It came from a young woman who had become the first member of her family to attend college because someone had quietly paid her tuition without revealing their name. The next letter came from a widower whose farm had survived because anonymous volunteers repaired his equipment before planting season. Another was written by parents whose child had received medical care during a difficult year when they believed they had run out of hope. Every page carried the same message expressed in different words. Someone believed in us before we believed in ourselves. Ethan slowly looked around the room. Many of the people seated there had written those very letters years earlier. They smiled gently, not because they expected thanks, but because they had become living proof that compassion continued multiplying long after its first quiet act. Ranger rested peacefully beside Ethan's chair, occasionally lifting his head whenever another voice filled the room with gratitude instead of sorrow. As the final letter was returned to the wooden box, Margaret spoke once more. Benjamin often reminded us that money can solve a problem for a season, but believing in another human being can change an entire lifetime. That is why he searched so carefully for the next steward. Ethan gazed through the tall windows where children played beneath the shade of old oak trees outside the community center. Watching their laughter echo across the town square, he realized the greatest inheritance had never been hidden beneath stone walls or locked behind forgotten doors. It lived quietly inside every heart that had chosen to transform unexpected kindness into kindness freely given once again. Autumn settled gently across the valley, painting the orchard with shades of crimson, amber, and deep gold that shimmered beneath clear morning skies. Every sunrise seemed to arrive with fresh purpose, and Ethan welcomed each new day with quiet gratitude rather than uncertainty. Ranger, an adult German shepherd, classic black and tan coat, strong healthy build, alert intelligent eyes, no accessories, remained faithfully at his side whether they were repairing old barns, delivering baskets of apples to elderly neighbors, or simply walking the peaceful trails that wound through the hills surrounding the community. The valley no longer depended upon one extraordinary man hidden behind a remarkable secret. It had become a place where ordinary people quietly carried extraordinary kindness into one another's lives. One cool afternoon, Eleanor invited Ethan to return with her to the mountain one final time before winter arrived. The familiar trail welcomed them with fallen leaves that whispered beneath their boots, while sunlight filtered softly through towering pines. Nothing about the forest felt mysterious anymore. Instead, it carried the comforting familiarity of an old friend whose greatest stories had already been shared. When they reached the forgotten estate, Ethan paused before the weathered stone walls that had changed the course of his life only weeks earlier. He remembered the first moment he had stepped inside believing survival depended upon finding something valuable. Now he understood that true value had quietly been waiting for someone willing to leave with less than he had found. They descended once more into the hidden chamber. The treasure remained untouched exactly as before, resting peacefully beneath its blanket of dust. Ethan barely glanced toward the stacks of gold before following Ranger through the familiar doorway leading to Benjamin's private room. The old journals still rested neatly upon their shelves. The folded flag remained carefully displayed above the fireplace. Every object stood exactly where it belonged, preserved not because it was expensive, but because it represented a life faithfully lived. Ranger walked directly toward the desk and sat beside the old rocking chair. Ethan smiled gently. "You knew this was the important room from the beginning, did not you, my friend?" Ranger responded only by looking quietly into Ethan's eyes before resting his head against Ethan's knee. Eleanor watched the simple moment with warmth in her expression. Benjamin once told me that the wisest companions are the ones who never become distracted by shiny things, she said softly. Perhaps animals understand that truth better than we do. Ethan opened the final drawer of the desk, curious whether he had overlooked anything during his first visit. Inside rested only one small wooden box no larger than his hand. It had been hidden beneath a stack of blank stationery and blended almost perfectly with the aged cedar lining of the drawer. There was no lock, only a handwritten note attached to the lid. For the faithful companion who found the smaller door. Ethan carefully lifted the lid. Inside lay a beautifully crafted leather collar that had never been worn, accompanied by a brass nameplate left blank. Beneath it rested a folded letter. Ethan unfolded the paper slowly. Benjamin's familiar handwriting appeared once more. Every guardian before you arrived with a loyal friend who recognized truth before wealth. I never placed a name upon this collar because I believed every generation would be blessed with a different companion. If your dog led you here, then he has already earned more honor than any object can provide. Let this remain unworn as a reminder that loyalty can never be improved by decoration. Ethan quietly smiled as he looked toward Ranger. The faithful dog needed no collar to reveal his character. His quiet devotion had already spoken more clearly than any symbol ever could. Ethan gently returned the untouched collar to the wooden box exactly as Benjamin had left it. Some treasures deserve to remain complete in their original purpose. Before leaving the room, Ethan noticed one final page tucked between the last journal and the bookshelf. It contained only a single sentence written in dark blue ink. When people remember the dog before they remember the gold, the future will remain safe. Ethan stood silently for several moments, allowing those words to settle deep within his heart. They perfectly explained every choice Ranger had made since entering the mountain. The faithful dog had never been searching for riches. He had been searching for the place where compassion still lived. As Ethan and Eleanor climbed back toward the afternoon sunlight, he glanced over his shoulder one final time at the quiet room, hidden beneath layers of stone and time. Nothing there asked to be possessed. Everything there simply invited the next worthy soul to choose wisely. Ranger trotted calmly beside him into the fresh autumn air, and Ethan realized that the greatest guide he had ever followed had never spoken a single word, yet had somehow led him more faithfully than any map ever could. Winter arrived quietly, not as an ending but as another gentle chapter in the valley's long story. Snow settled across the orchard like a soft white blanket, resting on every fence rail, rooftop, and tree branch until the entire landscape seemed wrapped in peaceful silence. Smoke curled lazily from farmhouse chimneys while warm lights glowed behind frosted windows, welcoming neighbors who gathered as naturally as family. Ethan no longer counted the passing weeks by miles traveled or temporary jobs completed. Instead, he measured time by harvests shared, roofs repaired before storms arrived, letters answered with kindness, and quiet evenings spent beside people who had taught him that belonging could be built one thoughtful act at a time. Ranger, an adult German shepherd, classic black and tan coat, strong healthy build, alert intelligent eyes, no accessories, had become a familiar sight throughout the valley. Children greeted him on their walk to school. Elderly neighbors smiled whenever he patiently carried small baskets beside Ethan during food deliveries. Farmers often laughed that the faithful dog somehow knew which gate needed closing before anyone else noticed. Yet Ranger accepted every gentle pat and grateful smile with the same calm humility he had shown the day he first stopped before the forgotten door beneath the mountain. He had never sought attention. He had only followed what quietly felt true. As the first anniversary of Ethan's arrival approached, the community gathered once more beneath the great maple tree overlooking the orchard. Long wooden tables stood covered with homemade bread, steaming soup, roasted vegetables, fresh pies, and warm cider prepared from apples harvested together during the autumn. Snowflakes drifted slowly through the crisp evening air while lanterns hanging from the branches cast a welcoming golden glow across familiar faces. Families laughed together. Children played in the snow. Older neighbors shared stories that had grown richer with every passing season. There was no ceremony waiting for Ethan, no speech celebrating his arrival, and no public acknowledgement of the hidden treasure sleeping peacefully beneath the mountain. That quiet absence felt exactly right. Benjamin's greatest lesson had never been forgotten. The work mattered more than the worker. After supper, Eleanor quietly invited Ethan to walk with her toward the edge of the orchard where the hills overlooked the valley below. The windows of homes sparkled like scattered stars across the peaceful countryside. She handed him a small wooden frame wrapped in soft cloth. Inside rested the photograph of Benjamin standing among smiling neighbors many years before. This time, however, another photograph had been carefully placed beside it. It showed children planting young apple trees while Ethan worked nearby repairing a fence, completely unaware that someone had captured the moment. Ranger stood faithfully at his side, watching the children with quiet attention. Benjamin never wanted statues, Eleanor said softly. He believed the best way to honor a life was to continue its kindness until no one remembered where it first began. Ethan looked at both photographs for a long moment before carefully closing the frame. He understood. Legacies were not preserved inside museums alone. They lived inside ordinary mornings, patient hands, open doors, and compassionate choices repeated often enough that they became part of a community's character. Several days later, Ethan returned alone to the mountain one final time before spring. He walked through the familiar forest while fresh snow crunched softly beneath his boots. Ranger remained beside him, matching every step with quiet confidence. They descended into the hidden chamber, where the gold still rested exactly as it always had, untouched beneath its blanket of dust. Ethan offered only a brief glance before continuing toward the smaller room beyond. He lit the old lantern resting on Benjamin's desk and placed one new journal beside the others. On its first page, he wrote only a single sentence. The light was never mine to keep. It was mine to carry forward. He closed the journal gently and returned it to the shelf without adding another word. Some stories did not need long endings. They only needed faithful continuation. As Ethan and Ranger climbed back toward daylight, the mountain seemed brighter than before, though nothing around them had changed. The same stone walls stood patiently. The same pine trees welcomed the wind. The same quiet path led back toward the waiting valley. Yet Ethan understood that miracles rarely announced themselves with thunder or dazzling displays. More often they arrived disguised as a faithful companion who pauses before an unnoticed door, an unexpected letter written years before it is needed, or a simple decision to place another person's future ahead of immediate reward. Together, Ethan and Ranger walked home beneath the pale winter sun, leaving the hidden chamber exactly as they had found it. The treasure remained safely beneath the mountain, but its true purpose continued walking across snowy fields, through welcoming homes, and into grateful hearts. And perhaps that had always been the greatest miracle of all, because the richest inheritance in the world was never measured by the gold someone kept, but by the hope they quietly left behind for others.